Right now, we're watching a very disturbing situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. We've seen tens of thousands of Armenians really fleeing the region after Azerbaijan invaded essentially last week. And as you look at this crisis, how avoidable was the most recent iteration of this crisis?
That's an excellent question. It was avoidable. I mean, for the last 9 months, experts, politicians, but also genocide experts have been raising red flag warnings. Foremost among them, the Raphael Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention has issued a number of red flag alerts and some very powerful studies and statements of the conditions on the ground. And then just, a week before the military operation that followed this siege in which civilians were being deprived of medicines and food. And then there was an all-out halting of all supplies to the region as of June 15th. We had Luis Moreno Ocampo made a statement and even published recently a Washington Post editorial noting that, these are genocidal conditions. By depriving people of food, you're producing these kind of group conditions that are meant to inflict genocide. We had plenty of time to act, but there was just no international will.
Well, and this, as you mentioned, this did not start last December. This crisis has been going on for a while, but that blockade, which deprived people of food, resources, medicine, people couldn't get surgeries, they couldn't leave to go into Armenia to come or go. And that word genocide, this is an area in which you are an expert. That sparks a lot of different things for a lot of different people. But I was going to ask you, and you started to answer it there, about this. Is this genocide? Does it meet, in your view, the definition of what a genocide is?
Well, I think one of the reasons why scholars are alarmed is because as scholars of genocide, we study historical patterns. So we've seen this type of deprivation before. In fact, Armenians suffered extreme deprivation, which was used as a tool of genocide during 1915, a subject that I just published a book on. And so thinking about, deprivation, shelter, medicine, food, water, we've seen this historically, whether it's, deprivation of water with the Herero by the Germans in East Africa, or, in the case of the Armenians of 1915, extreme deprivation. But we also have these kind of siege tactics that have been easily called genocidal in other contexts. And it's really about the international will, whether we want to use that legal label, because it automatically triggers an international obligation to halt genocide. And so what we've had really since the 90s, especially thinking about thinking about Bosnia, is the use of this euphemism of ethnic cleansing. So you'll see ethnic cleansing used a lot in the media, but it's a way of absolving international responsibility, because the interests in this region of Nagorno-Karabakh, or what the Armenians call Artsakh, are very deep. They're deep pockets. Corporations that have contracts to get in there for mining, because there are some pristine territories to extract. So underneath the surface, you'll find many different interests. Some of it is oil, with regard to Azerbaijan being a petro-dictatorship, being a hereditary dictatorship on par with Syria and North Korea, has fashioned itself as an ally of the United States and European Union. And in that sense, we have this kind of allyship in the course of, under the pretext of also supplying the EU with oil to replace Russian oil, which of course they can't do. Russian oil is still coming into Europe and in higher numbers. So I think that we have some really deep interests in the region that are making it so we're not going to see the word genocide used except for the very brave.
Yeah, well, and I want to get into, you brought up a lot there that I think is important to unpack. When you look at this crisis, you have a situation where Azerbaijan is saying this is their land, essentially, that this has always been their land, that they're taking back land that is theirs. But help us understand the history of this land, because it seems the Armenians have been living in Nagorno-Karabakh for quite some time.
Well, the truth is, it's a very diverse region. And so and I'm a critic of nationalism, so I want to forefront that by saying, if I look at this as a historian, what I see are really diverse groups of people who were able to live together, not perfectly peacefully, but they were coexisting. And then we have the introduction of nationalism, especially ethno-nationalism that has pulled that region apart. And it's Azerbaijan in particular it is not a free society. It has been declared an unfree country by Freedom House, and so it's a place where there's not even the freedom of intellectual inquiry to actually interrogate historical questions. So there's that problem. But then there's also the Azerbaijani state has its own narrative, which is that Armenians are invaders who didn't live there. So it's a complete denial that Armenians have any right to exist there. They have, declared Armenian monuments, Caucasian Albanian monuments, which we have a number of scholars working on that particular issue as well, in order to erase that Armenian presence that's been there for over 2,000 years, at least in recorded history. And so the question is, what do we do with that situation? And what the Armenians have been told is sit at the negotiating table, make a peace agreement, learn to coexist. Well, Armenians were at the negotiating table when this military incursion happened. So, some people have called it peace of the graveyard, is what the Raphael Lemkin Institute called it. It's like you're going to sit there and negotiate for peace as you are being invaded. And already Azerbaijan has not only declared Artsakh as Azerbaijan, or Nagorno-Karabakh as Azerbaijan, but also Armenia has been declared Western Azerbaijan, which is very dangerous. We have already seen Armenia invaded last year, and we're anticipating that again, because now, with no accountability, Baku can basically do what it wants in the region.
Well, and it also seems Turkey is co-signing all of this, obviously, as well. And we know the history with the Ottoman Empire, as you know better than anybody. That seems alarming to watch that alliance, get even deeper in the midst of this, with the president of Turkey heading over to Azerbaijan and praising this. When you look at all of the things that are unfolding surrounding this is not a partisan question. It wouldn't matter who was in power at the time when this happened. Right now, it happens to be U.S. President Joe Biden. But what responsibility does the Biden administration have? I've seen some very strong words from you and others on this in light of what we've seen happen in the last week and a half here.
I mean, it doesn't get richer than this, right? Joe Biden courted the Armenian community under the pretext that he was going to acknowledge the Armenian genocide, which he promptly did. But, as a scholar of genocide, I have to ask, what good is that if this genocide is also happening under his watch? And so I do believe genocidal conditions have been created, and there is a green light right now to continue it. And that means that as long as there is no accountability or pushback from the international community, especially the United States, we're going to see more of this, and it's happening under his watch. And so I think he should be very concerned, not just about the domestic voting situation, but his legacy. And I think it was particularly difficult to watch Samantha Power come to the region and make some statements of being troubled and concerned, asking for more negotiating and more compromise. That has been the message of Washington, D.C. to the Armenians. But what hasn't happened is any kind of pushback or resistance against Azerbaijan's worst tendencies. So if the United States has decided that they want to align themselves with this hereditary dictatorship in the South Caucasus, they need to be able to rein that in. Otherwise, we're going to see it, continue. And the fear is that, the promise to conquer Armenia will be next, because then it will provide that corridor to Turkey, to get back to the original part of your earlier part of your question, to link Azerbaijan to Turkey for trade, but also, a kind of brotherhood, two nations, one people, kind of mantra that both regimes are touting right now.
Well, and I know one of the statements I saw from you, the Biden administration has blood on its hands essentially in this. And it would, again, no matter who was in power, allowing it to fester. When you have 9 months, I think that's the part of this that's so hard for so many. I know Christian Solidarity International, we've had people on from that organization, lots of other organizations, human rights activists sounding the alarm over these 9 months. And, for two officials to fly out there, after this has already happened and people are fleeing, I think that is that's a little hard to swallow for people looking at this and wondering, why didn't you do something sooner? Just to ask you as we round out to a close on this, what in your view are some things that could be done, by the US government and by other Western leaders to stop this in its tracks and prevent further carnage?
Well, I don't know about stopping in its tracks because unfortunately that time I think has passed. The region is now 50% depopulated of Armenians. And so it didn't have a very large group of Armenians, but it did have 120,000 and more than that have already fled. And what we're asking for is guarantees of safe passage. Azerbaijan has offered overtures that they will not abuse any Armenians who stay behind. And what we know from the past wars, the ones who stayed behind are usually the elderly, the indigent, the ones who can't walk, the disabled. And so they bore the brunt of several horrific atrocities in 2020. So we would like to see an international effort to assist those who seek to leave. And unfortunately, I think the time has passed for even trying to preserve Armenian self-determination, which they had a right to, but the international community decided that after Kosovo, they weren't going to grant it to others. I think we also, if we want to see peace in the region, we need guarantees of Armenian sovereignty, territorial sovereignty for internationally recognized borders of Armenia. Those are what would be under attack next. And so America has been courting Armenia, did a NATO exercise with Armenia just 2 weeks ago. But we need more than that, and we need more than Samantha Power showing up with crocodile tears. We need actual action because our international mechanisms are showing great weakness on this front. And that's not only from Armenia, but from Syria, from Tigray, and other regions. You can even go back to Darfur. And so we really need the international bodies to make this a priority over corporate interests if we're going to see these international laws in any way preserved moving into the future, because we're looking at more catastrophes, climate disasters. We need to be ready for how we're going to preserve human life and human dignity in those conditions.
And if there were any fear whatsoever, this wouldn't have happened, right? I think that's the undercurrent here is, they acted the way they did because there really was no fear, it seems, of retribution. And why would there be after 9 months of relative silence? Professor, really appreciate your time today breaking this all down for us.
Thank you for having me.